Welcome to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today we are talking about getting the most out of your bar practice. Your Bar Exam Toolbox hosts are Allison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the bar exam experience so you can study effectively, stay sane, and hopefully pass and move on with your life. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Allison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on your favorite listening app and check out our sister podcast, the Law School Toolbox podcast. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on barexamtoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back. Well, we've been spending a lot of time lately talking to bar takers about what happened with their previous attempts and why their studying maybe failed them. And one thing keeps coming up over and over again, which is effective practice. So, Lee, what is effective practice?
Well, practice isn't just about reviewing an outline and, even reading a question. You want to make sure that you're really getting the most out of any practice that you're doing. That means that you're learning from it, that you're struggling with it, that you're doing things that make yourself uncomfortable. So what I wanted to do today was run through our top tips to get the most out of your practice and set yourself up for exam day. Because if you're going to spend time practicing, you might as well get something out of it.
Yeah, and I think, practice really is the most critical component. Most people I talk to who fail, they say to me, well, I spent a lot of time watching videos. I'm not sure how effective it was. Mm-hmm. And then I ask them, well, how much practice did you do? And they say, oh, well, either none or not very much, or I did a couple of practice questions every week, and they're feeling pretty good about that. Yeah.
So this is one of the things that we really push our students to do is to do practice, but make sure you're learning through the practice. So let's run through our list of kind of things to consider when you're thinking about the most effective practice. So the first thing is it's not just enough to do practice questions. So this really is the opposite of maybe what some of the students you've been talking to have been doing, which maybe isn't enough practice. I've also talked to people who, say, well, I've done 100 practice questions. And I was like, that's great. Did you really learn from them?
Right. Did you just do them and set those aside, never think about them again?
Yeah, because I think that if you're just doing this practice and to check the box of saying that you've done it and you don't spend time, comparing your essays to the model answers or the answer keys or rewriting or evaluating or drilling or thinking about how you could write better or more efficiently, I think that can be a huge problem. Then you're really just wasting your time. You might as well be listening to videos.
Yeah, and sometimes, people say to me, well, I just don't know what I'm supposed to be writing down. I don't know what a passing essay looks like. And there are resources, particularly in California, where you can answer that question for yourself. And you need to be answering that question for yourself. Go get a subscription to baressays.com if you're not sure what a passing and not passing essay looks like, because they have a lot of essays for basically, every question, I would imagine, that are real essays that actual people submitted and got graded on. So you can look at it and see, what's the difference between a 55 and a 70 on this question.
Yep. And for the UBE folks out there, a lot of jurisdictions do even publish some student answers. And so you can spend some time online looking for those student answers. That's going to be different than the score sheets from the National Conference of Bar Examiners. We're going to talk about the score sheets a little bit later. But there are resources out there. You just kind of have to dig for them. But the point I wanted to make starting this discussion is doing practice isn't the same thing as really learning from it.
Yeah, that's step one. You've got to do it. But then after that, ideally, you should be actually doing something with that practice as well. And the same on the MBE. Just doing a bunch of questions is not really sufficient.
Yeah. All right. So our second tip is that goes back to what you were talking about, Allison, that some people think just doing a couple practice questions a week can be enough.
Oh, yeah. They feel like, wow, I've been doing so much writing. It's like, well, you do realize on test day, you're going to have to write 6 essays in one day. So have you ever done that?
Right.
Before?
For the UBE. Yeah.
So, there's a lot of writing to be done on test day. So you need to be doing a lot of writing in practice.
Yeah. And I think when you think about your study time and you're looking at your study schedule, if you're doing a 60-minute essay or a 30-minute essay, depending on your jurisdiction, you shouldn't say, okay, I have 60 minutes, so I'll do a question. Because it needs to be 60 minutes plus 20 minutes, 30 minutes to review and learn from that question. So, even though there's still plenty of time to do that practice, you also want to set realistic expectations for yourself. If you are not writing every day, however, that is definitely not enough.
I mean, also, I feel like, how do you know if you even know this material unless you're doing practice? So it's one thing to be able to recite the elements of a particular tort or tell me about hearsay, but can you actually apply that? That's what we need to know. And you can't find that out unless you do the work.
That's true. This is active learning, which we've talked about a lot on the podcast as well.
Yep.
Okay, so we now know that you can't just do a ton of questions. You have to actually study from them. You actually have to learn from them. You have to actually do more than just a couple of questions a week. You need to be writing every day, sometimes multiple essays a day. And another common thing that we hear is people mentioning that they are just outlining questions instead of writing them out. And I think this is also really problematic because you aren't practicing how to analyze facts to law. And you aren't really being forced to recall the specific language that you will write down on the test. I think that's hugely problematic. And I think it can give you a false sense of confidence.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I talk to people who, have failed multiple times and the writing is consistently a problem. And they say, well, I just outlined a bunch of questions. And I'm like, well, this was the fourth time you took the exam. So didn't you think maybe you need to actually do the work on the writing because you're not getting that? This is not working for you. And I think, outlining, I mean, sure, it kind of plays into that idea of like, I just have to know the law. It's a way to kind of quiz yourself on, do you know the law? And it's better than nothing. But being able to actually write something out, particularly with the MEE in 30 minutes in a coherent way, is very different than just outlining it.
Yeah. And I think the critical piece when we look at, failing answers, when we try to determine why you didn't pass, usually what we see is a lack of legal analysis. You're not arguing both sides. You are not using all of the facts in the question. And when you outline, typically most people, when they outline, don't include those details. And so if you are finding that you're getting feedback that you're too conclusory or that you don't have enough analysis, you're not using all the facts, outlining isn't going to get you where you need to be. You have to practice writing out the facts. You have to practice arguing them to make sure you're getting all the points possible. I think this is specifically a challenge for attorneys who are already licensed who might be taking a bar in a different jurisdiction, because so often they'll be like, why would I have all that analysis? No one would pay me to write all of that analysis in my job. And the reality is this is not your job. This is a constructed academic exercise, and you have to get comfortable writing in this style or you're not going to get points.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, writing it out also helps you with things like, what are you doing with your headers? What are you doing with your transition sentences? These are things that the more you write them, they just become second nature.
Right.
But you need to know how you're going to talk about these facts. How do you talk about something that is a close issue versus something that's not a close issue? Having all these phrases kind of ready to go is going to help with your speed, which is really a huge issue for a lot of people. They just don't finish. And if you don't finish, then you're setting yourself up for a real deficit.
Yeah. I think the other thing that happens when you just outline is oftentimes you'll say, oh, I know this is an assault issue. And then you'll write down assault. But could you tell me exactly what you're going to write down for the rule for assault?
Right. What are the elements of assault?
And then what are the buzzwords that you have to have, And because one of the things to increase speed and accuracy is you need to be able to not just say, I kind of know what assault is or the difference between assault and a battery. I think it's the actual offensive touching. I
never remember which is which. So this is why I would have to write them out, because I could write down assault and battery, but if you asked me to actually write down the rule statement for each one, I would probably have to think about that.
Yeah, I think assault is you have an imminent fear of bodily harm, and I think you actually get touched.
Yeah,
maybe not.
I
Anyway,
think that's right.
Okay, so again, this is why you can't just have, these great ideas in your head or these rules like floating around in your head. You have to not only practice recalling them, but writing them down, and you want to get comfortable writing down heavily tested issues over and over and over again. And the best way to do that is to practice these questions over and over and over again. And that's one of the reasons why when we built the Brainy Bar Bank that's available on our website as a database where you could, pull up how many questions talk about assault and battery, then you could do an assault and battery question and another assault and battery question and another one. I bet by the end, you wouldn't be confused about the difference between assault and battery.
No, you would just say like, hey, assault is blah, 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 battery is blah, blah, blah. Let me look at the facts.
Right, exactly.
We're not at that point because we're not studying for the
bar. Right. All right. So another kind of tip or thing that you want to think about with your practice is making sure that you practice under timed conditions. So I think this is another huge mistake people will make, because studying this for this test and getting yourself ready to write out your answers, it's very important when you're studying for this test to think about, what's the best answer you can write in the amount of time allowed, because it can really create a false sense of security when people give themselves, an hour for a 30-minute question or 2 hours for a 60-minute question. And then they turn it in for feedback and they're like, I rocked this question. And you're like, but what could you do in an hour?
Right.
I don't care what you can do in 2 hours. The bar examiners definitely don't care what you can do in 2 hours.
And sometimes you see this looking at score reports, and somebody will start off strong, and you're like, was this a subject area you were really strong in? They say, oh, no, I took 45 minutes for a 30-minute essay, and then I ran out of time on the rest.
Yeah. So you've got to get comfortable practicing under these time conditions. Now, in the beginning, I don't think it's terrible if you need an extra 5 or 10 minutes, maybe even 15. Maybe not for the MBE, for the UBE, because that's only 30 minutes. So I would maybe take an extra 10 if you need to look up the law or something like that. But by, halfway through your study, by 4 weeks before the test, you've got to be doing this all under time conditions, because the other thing is you need to be able to carefully appreciate what that period of time feels like. You need to know what it feels like to write in 30 minutes. And so you kind of have bells going off in your head being like, uh-oh, time's running out, before you're constantly checking your time. The same thing on California for 60 minutes. The same thing on the performance test. I think that's another area where people are like, well, just shave off time. You don't have a lot of extra time. 90 minutes is not long enough.
No.
You don't have a lot of time to be twiddling your thumbs. So you've got to force yourself to do this stuff in time conditions. The other thing I hear from some students, and I don't know, Allison, if some have told you this as well, but they will say that, like, I just can't stop.
Yeah, I just can't make myself move on.
Yeah.
I don't know what to do.
And so that is something you got to work on.
Yeah, I mean, my response to that is pretty much like, well, you just cannot be that self-indulgent. If I was sitting beside you and took your computer away, we could make you stop. So you have to do that for yourself.
Yep, sit on your hands, literally. Whatever you got to do.
When the timer goes off, you have to move on.
Yeah. And I think that the way to create that self-discipline is to practice it.
Yeah, and for me, like, I would tend to make, say I was doing a 60-minute essay, I might write down a time that was 55 minutes in. So then when I see that time, it's not immediately that second have to move on, but I have to move on in 5 minutes. So I have 5 minutes basically to wrap up whatever I'm saying, write out what seems most important, and prepare to move on, and then move on.
So there was a thread being discussed in our tutoring Slack group, our work group, where somebody was asking if it is worth it to, spend different amounts of times on different questions to try and maximize your points.
Yeah, I think the actual discussion was whether it made sense to just completely skip one of the ME questions to do better on the rest.
Okay, fair point.
Which is an even more extreme version of that same idea. I mean, I think it's numerically possible to pass only doing 5 of the 6 essays. However, you're setting yourself up a pretty deep hole on everything else. And odds are, if you're someone who's going to need to skip an entire essay, you're probably not knocking it out of the park on this other stuff either.
Well, I think that's the other thing that people often don't think about, because I think it's rarefied air to get up to those high scores.
Right, exactly.
And so, if you're thinking, okay, well, if I just write down something, I'll get a certain number of points, right? But to get those, to climb higher and higher for these almost perfect scores, you may need more than just a little extra time to get those high numbers.
Right. I mean, you can think about it kind of like the law school curve. Mm-hmm. If the top MEE score is an 80, I think there are very few people getting a 75 or an 80. There are probably very few people getting a 70, in fact. Most people are kind of clustered in that range around like 60, 65, like right around passing.
Right.
If you're at the very top or very bottom of that range, well, it's probably a pretty rare place to be.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so do the work under time conditions.
Well, and also try to do every question.
Okay, that's true.
I would say basically give a good faith effort, because it's going to be easier to move from, say, a 20, which you get basically for showing up. I don't know if they even actually require you to write down anything for a 20, but, assume they give you 20 points for showing up.
In what, California?
In the MEE.
Oh, in the MEE.
Yeah, MEE world here.
Okay.
20 to 80.
20 to 80.
So to get from a 20 to like a 55 or a 60, which are not great scores, but also are not going to totally sink your chances, is probably way easier than getting from, say, a 60 to a 75.
Yeah. I think that's New York, though. I think other jurisdictions, they do the 1, 2, 3, 4.
True. Right.
So
well, yeah.
You get the
Basically,
idea.
yeah. The idea.
You show up, you write something down, you get like a pretty low score, and you climb up from that.
Yeah. So in that case, you're right, talking about New York scoring. Thank you.
You're welcome. just over here to be the attention to detail police.
Yeah, I was just looking at this, and it was definitely New York. Yes.
All right. So let's move on to our next point, which is people don't spend enough time evaluating their own work, which is one of the things we've already talked about a bit in the podcast. But I wanted to dive in to some specifics about like what I mean when I'm talking about this. So, this is how the magic happens. This is how you learn and shift your writing style and change your habits. And so this is where the painful stuff is. People don't want to evaluate their own work because, one, people don't like to be critical, and it is anxiety inducing if you're going to make judgments about your own work. This is why people don't proofread either. And then you have to really own the fact that you might have screwed up and make yourself do it again. It's not fun.
No, but I think, you have to take a step back and get a little bit more objective. And sometimes people self-identify with the work probably more than is really a great idea. Mm-hmm. I think to the extent you can just review this as, hey, this is the work I did at this particular day and time, and let's like objectively see how I did. Mm-hmm. Not, I'm a stupid person if I missed this issue, which is not helpful.
Right. This is where yoga really comes into it, right? Meet yourself where you are today.
Right. And, evaluate it as if it was somebody else's. I mean, you might even ask someone else to evaluate it for you. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's a tutor, but maybe it's just your friend or family member or someone. Give them the model answer and have them go through and just see, objectively speaking, did I talk about this? Yeah.
You can also, if you are studying with a group of friends, if you do sit down and do practice, you can always pass the question, or mix them up if you don't want everybody to know whose question is what, and then talk about how you would evaluate it. And then, there are lots of different ways that you can do this. But the reality is you're probably not going to get to use these cheater ways of not doing it yourself to do enough of the questions, because every single essay that you do needs to be evaluated. And unless you are going to work with a tutoring program that's going to evaluate every practice essay that you do, you need to do this work yourself.
Well, and you need to be able to self-evaluate on exam day, in real time. Am I spotting the issues? Am I using the facts? That kind of thing.
Yeah. So let's talk about what we think would be like a consistent method of evaluation. So we have our own kind of recommendations that we use with our tutoring students, but these are some of the things that you want to kind of make a list for yourself to check off as you go through and evaluate your work. So the first one is, not shockingly, did you spot the issues? You can't get enough points if you don't talk about all the issues.
Right, exactly. And sometimes people can be a little self-indulgent on that. Well, I got most of them. It's like, okay, well, most of them, is that 1/3, 2/3, half? Like what deficit are we working from here?
Exactly. And one of the ways that you also know if you spot all the issues is, did you use all the facts?
Right. If you have facts that are kind of glaring that you don't know what to do with, I think that's always an opportunity to take a step back and really think about, is there any reason that they would want me to talk about this? Because there probably is. Yeah.
And then you've got to make sure that within those issues, you have IRAC'd them and that your rule is correct. So, not just did you put down a rule, but did you use those buzzwords,
Right. Did you do it with elements that you then used in your analysis one by one?
Exactly. Something that a lot of people forget to do is conclude.
Right. So you conclude on like sub-issues. Mm-hmm. And, the court may or may not find something is not a conclusion. Yeah. You need to actually take a stand and say, well, based on this, I think the answer will be X.
Yeah. I also think it's important to make sure that you organize it correctly. So, sometimes there can be more than one way to organize an answer, but it's important to remember that bar examiners are not going to go hunting for things in your answer. They're like, I wonder if they talked about that. Like, there's no time for that.
Right. I mean, if they give you, say, for example, a criminal question and there are 3 people in it and they ask you about each of their possible, defenses or whatever, you need to organize it by person. Yep. Like, that's what they're looking for.
Yeah, that's the
end of story.
Exactly. So, with that organization needs to come clean and clear headers with some formatting scheme. So you're formatting them the same way all the time because that's something else you do not want to spend time in the room thinking about. So check off that. And then the last thing that I always feel very passionate about is this idea of, is your writing clean and professional? And this is different from flawless because there is no assumption that you're spending a lot of time proofreading your work because who has the time? But what is important is that you are presenting yourself in a professional way, because this is like an interview. This is like an audition. Basically, you have somebody who is a licensed attorney deciding whether or not you are also ready to share their law license. And if it looks like, I've always said, if it looks like it's wearing a sweatsuit, then you're not going to get the job.
Yeah, exactly. You want to think of this as an interview almost. You're presenting your best self in the time that is available.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that is, do you sound like a lawyer? Do you sound like you're engaging in the thought processes that a competent lawyer engages in?
Yeah.
And you may get details wrong, and of course you might not remember every piece of the law, and that's not the expectation. The expectation, I can imagine if I were a grader, I'm kind of sitting there thinking, well, if I gave this person, time to go look this up, could they get it right? Right.
And we have gotten a lot of questions over the years, especially from foreign trained attorneys or even U.S. trained law students who maybe English is not their first language. And so they might make grammatical errors. And they're really concerned that that's going to prevent them from passing. And all the feedback we've gotten from bar graders is that is not what prevents you from passing. What prevents you from passing is, not, a typo or a misuse of a word, but, not being able to communicate effectively. They can tell if you're making, a pronoun mistake because maybe your writing isn't as flawless because it doesn't feel like English is your first language, but they would assume you would proofread it if you had the time. But if you don't use terms of art, if you, don't use the constructs of the English language at all, if you are sloppy and not focused, that is totally different.
Yeah, I think sometimes people, the worst writing is often just the brain dump. Mm-hmm. And that does not look like you were thinking logically. You want to be thinking logically. I mean, it's much better to write less and have it be clean and logical than to write every single thing you possibly could think of about this topic and not really hit on the main points in a way that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, really take a step back. I mean, I think if you're evaluating your work, for example, if you see an entire page of writing that does not have paragraphs,
that's a problem.
That is probably something you need to work on.
Yep.
You want to have short sentences, short paragraphs, headers in between. The average page might even have like 2 to 3 headers on it because you're trying to give people that roadmap. So that's kind of what you're looking for.
Yeah. You don't need a lot of finesse. You just need to get the material on paper.
Short, straight, to the point is going to be a lot better.
So one of the reasons I think people don't want to do this practice and give themselves feedback is they get frustrated by the model answers for California and the score sheets provided by the National Conference of Bar Examiners for the UBE. And that's because they feel like they can't see exactly what they need to do. So the California answers are real student answers, but they're anomalies.
They're the person who spent, 90 minutes and happens to practice in this area, and maybe they didn't even pass.
Right. I don't know. I think they might have had to have passed to be the model answer.
Probably.
But still. Yeah. They are not easily recreatable. And so what you oftentimes get these answers, and if you've never seen the California Bar Packet, they give you a model or an answer A and an answer B. And the problem is answer A and answer B do not match perfectly. And sometimes there's even incorrect stuff in them, which is really what sends me over the edge. So
yeah, or like one answer will talk about something and the other one won't, and you're left saying, well, do I need to talk about this? I don't know.
Right. Exactly. So a rule of thumb, and I think one of our tutors came up with this idea, is to think about it as a Venn diagram. You kind of have answer A and answer B are 2 circles that are going to cross over for a good amount of the issues. Everything that both answers talk about must be included. Like you could not pass without discussing the issues that both answers talked about. And then the other stuff is kind of gravy. That means that it was, hopefully good or right because they included it. But that's not the, oh my gosh, if I didn't include this stuff, then, I'm completely wrong and I'm going to fail. So that's, I think, the best way to think about those California answers. You're using them as a guide. You're using them to see what absolutely needed to be included. And then you're using them for examples of what the graders clearly thought successful legal analysis was, although I think they can be awfully wordy sometimes and include a lot of extra stuff that doesn't need to be included to get a high score.
Right, but I think at a minimum, you can look at that for a structure for like, oh, okay, if I'm seeing things consistently in these answers, maybe I should be trying to do similar things.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Well, just as we mentioned earlier, if you want to see more realistic answers, baressays.com is your go-to source.
Yeah, because what they will show you is a 55 and a 60 and a 65 and a 70.
Which I think would be really eye-opening to people. Yeah. Sometimes people think like, oh, I don't feel like I did that badly, but I got a 55. Why is that?
Yeah.
It's like, well, you need to go look at a 65 answer and see what seems different.
Yep. But then here's the rub. So in California, if you get above a certain score on your overall kind of first pass of the scoring, you get what they call a second read. And then sometimes you'll even see essays that have 10-point swings. I've even seen 15-point.
I find that amazing.
Yeah. So that can make you really angry if you chew on it for long enough. But what that does...
Well, and you can see them in either direction, too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, but what you have to realize is this grading is still subjective, and that two graders, like a grader could think you got a 75, which is a fairly high pass, or 65, which is basically like barely passing, almost failing. And so it's like, okay, well, how is that possible? Well, that's a conversation for a different day. But the reality is you can only get so caught up in those scores because you don't exactly know what the scores are going to be that day, at that time, with that grader. But what you can do is present your best work, and then the scores,
Yeah, exactly.
They're
it's like anything else. The scores fall where they fall, but you can make your best effort to get yourself into the range of a passing score.
Yeah. Well, now that people are happy they're not studying for the California bar, we can move on to the UBE. So if you're studying for the UBE, the National Conference of Bar Examiners, they release these score sheets, which are definitely not real student answers because they include
people
citations.
Get really confused by these.
They get really, really frustrating and very overwhelming because for a 30-minute answer, it's like a couple pages. Oh,
yeah, they've got citations.
Yeah, it's got all these details. And so you have to, again, have an approach of how you're going to look at these score sheets and decide what you're going to include. So a few things to look at. You're really looking at what issues are tested and maybe even the percentage noted for that, for how much that issue is worth. So again, it helps you decide, was this a minor issue, a major issue? If this was 30% of your grade and you didn't talk about it, then you're not going to pass.
Right. And I think it can be a good check because if you thought something was a minor issue and they think it's a major issue or vice versa, that probably has to do with your understanding of the law.
Yep.
And you need to work on that.
Yep. Then you want to look for the rule analysis and conclusion, which is in their lengthy dialogue, including citations. But you don't, just because stuff is in this score sheet doesn't mean that it has to be in your answer. It's just giving you more information. So you can still kind of take a step back and say, what is my rule? What is my analysis and my conclusion? And what would be a condensed version of that? This is why in our Writing of the Week program for the MEE and the MPT questions, we kind of provide what we call like an issue sheet. What we think is kind of a pared down way to approach a lot of these questions. I think as a studier, you can do that for yourself. Evaluate these score sheets and say, okay, what's the IRAC for this issue? Leaving out all of this extra information.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you could even take that score sheet, read it, and then write your essay in 30 minutes and see what you come up with. Because that's actually not even that easy.
Yeah,
you might think like, after I've read the answer, I would be able to do this quickly, but can you?
Yeah. So you just have to, check yourself. Your answer is not going to match these score sheets in any way, shape, or form, but it's just a map for what your answer should look like. So you have to have an approach so you don't get kind of spinning chaos, frustration out of, trying to look at these score sheets.
Yeah, they are pretty weird, I'll be honest. You look at them and the first time you're like, whoa, what? This is for a 30-minute essay?
Yeah, it's very weird. It's very shocking.
What are they giving me
Which is why people want to practice them in 60 minutes because they're like, well, maybe I could create something. But then you still don't have case citations.
Yeah, they're really kind of strange.
No, thank you, NCBE. Okay, so our last one, because we're running low on time, you got to rewrite these questions when you mess up.
Yeah, I think that's a really underutilized resource, particularly if you do have, sort of a roadmap to your answer. Rewrite it and try to get closer to that.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing I think that I've heard from folks, especially if you've sat for the exam multiple times, is, well, I've done all the questions.
Right. I've seen this question before.
It's like, well, great. Can you execute it?
Exactly. It's also like, well, if you see like a community property question on the exam, it's probably going to be a lot of the same scenarios with different names. So go ahead and do it. Yeah,
I had a guy I talked to, a prospective student who got a 75 on one of the questions. And I said, wow, what happened on that question? and this is in California, and he's like, oh, I did a question on that exact issue like the day before the exam. You know, it was part of his study. He's like, it was very familiar to me. I just recreated that question. I'm like, that is our point, that you have to do lots of practice strategically on heavily tested issues so you can have seen some of this stuff before, because they can only get so creative.
I guess someone I went to law school with who was studying in New York and failed several times, the way she finally passed is she only studied from the sample answers, which they gave out at that point before they were UBE. And she literally said it was like being Pavlov's dog. You know, she had studied for several months, just basically breaking down the sample answers, rewriting them. And so when she got to the exam, I mean, she even had some issues. You know, she was throwing up in the bathroom, whatever. And she passed because she was like, it wasn't even hard. I just like spotted it. It was like, oh, that's the same issue they talked about in this other one. Wrote down my analysis, moved on.
So, you know, we hear from students over and over and over again that people don't want to practice because it is hard. But practice, I know.
That's kind of the point.
But so studying for the bar. But practice is the best active learning you can do. If you're struggling with evaluating your work, this is where I think working with a tutor can really help, using a tool like Bar Essays, if you're in California, to be able to compare your work to other student work at different levels can be very helpful. But you need to get additional guidance so you can understand how to make your questions look like passing answers. And then, you know, you just got to do this over and over and over again. Because I think the goal when you walk in and sit down for the bar is that you get the question, you're like, oh, I've seen this sort of thing before.
Yeah, and they're going to throw weird stuff at you. You know, they're going to come up with stuff you probably haven't seen before. But you want the majority of the writing to be on stuff that you're think, this is pretty familiar.
Yep.
And then you get that curveball and you do your best.
Yep, exactly. Well, with that, I think we're out of time. I want to take a second to remind you to check out our blog at barexamtoolbox.com, which is full of helpful tips to help you prepare and stay sane as you study for the bar exam. You can also find information on our website about our courses, tools, and one-on-one tutoring programs to support you as you study for the UBE or California bar exam. We also have a new Practice of the Week program to help you study for the MBE that we encourage you to check out. If you enjoyed this episode of the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you are still in law school, you might also like to check out our popular Law School Toolbox podcast as well. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Allison at lee@barexamtoolbox.com or allison@barexamtoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via the website contact form at barexamtoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.